10 seconds. It's funny, isn't it? Yes. All right. Are we live? Thanks, and welcome to the session on multi-stakeholder collaborations and effective approaches to landscape management. So my name is Pippa Howard. I am the Director of Business and Nature at Fauna and Flora International. This is my 4th Congress, so I kind of feel like I've been around the clock. This is a business hub that has grown, and listening to the speeches yesterday and the number of businesses that are now involved in trying to understand but also respond to the crisis of loss of nature. It's brilliant that whilst we don't have that many in the room right now, we know that there are a lot of people, a lot of companies and a lot of actors and stakeholders interested in this agenda. So this morning we've got a panel. We've got Helen Crowley, who is Head of Sustainable Sourcing and Nature Initiatives at Kering. Is that right, Helen? Fantastic, I've remembered that one. And then we've got 3 others who are going to join us remotely. So we've got, let me make sure I get this in. We've got Julie Renaud from Nespresso. We have April with Craig, and we've got April as well joining us all the way from Indonesia. So we'll introduce them when the time comes. So I'm going to start this session off and hopefully be fairly relaxed but also quite interactive too. The whole idea of a panel session and a discussion is to get you involved. So please feel free to ask questions. We'll have a whole discussion moment at the end of this. But we've got my introduction, which I'm going to talk to for about 10 minutes. Then I'll ask Helen to come up, and then we'll get our online representatives. Now, this is our first trial of a kind of hybrid system, so forgive us, but we have a master techies in the corner here who're going to make sure it all works. Right, so we've got this triple crisis going on, or triple crises going on right now. You've heard the story, the climate, biodiversity, water crisis, all amongst the pandemic crisis. But we're failing miserably, really, to respond to these in any, well, effective way. And so what we're trying to look at today is the sort of approaches that are needed in complex landscapes to essentially incentivize and stimulate far more collaboration so that we achieve the objectives that we need to around recovering nature. So we failed to meet our SDGs, we failed to meet the Millennium Development Goals before those, and we're struggling to define what's needed for our post-2020 to the 2030 agenda too. So where are we now? Currently we're on the bottom line, massively sliding into the bottom right-hand corner, and we need to be at the top. So what do we need to do? We know from all the reports that are coming out of the World Economic Forum, from what the WBSCSD is doing, but the Dasgupta report that came out from the UK earlier this year, that nature is critical to our economies. We cannot develop sustainably without taking nature into consideration. So here we are today, and what we're postulating is that, you know, in these really complex multi-use landscapes that we're operating in, a forest where a tree can be turned into a pulp that turns into viscose, that becomes processed into a piece of clothing that you or I may have in our wardrobes, or whether it's a mine that is producing bauxite that gets turned into aluminium through some sort of processing into an espresso capsule, or whether it's, you know, a production landscape where, you know, our food comes from. These are all multi-use landscapes, a very complex picture where we're all interacting, sometimes competing for our natural resources, and very often sharing them too. So that competition and conflict, which has, you know, around the raw material supply chains that we need to keep our businesses afloat and keep our cupboards full and our clothing on our bodies, etc. These are all starting to integrate and intermix, and they're all competing. So how do we look at these complex landscapes, and how do we work with our stakeholders? And I'm hoping that our panel will respond to this today. I wanted to share a piece of work that FFI did, which is called the CALM framework, okay? We all have to be calm about the way we approach this. But CALM stands for Collaborative Approaches to Applying the Mitigation Hierarchy in Complex Multi-Use Landscapes. Now that's a big mouthful, so CALM is a far better way to refer to it. But this is the one scenario, and what we're trying to aim for is a more nature-centric, nature-positive scenario where all actors in a landscape work together to kind of get a far more intact, resilient, natural system. So we wanted to start with ecosystem-based approach to understand what these socio-ecological systems are, so how people and nature interact and are interdependent, so that we can then start to devise interventions, strategies, and collaborations to make sure that we are maintaining the ecological potential and the natural capital of our systems. So we have these two roads. You don't have to read this, it is complex, but there are two roads, the high road and the low road. We want to go the low road. The high road is really about rampant development. It's about each actor in a landscape acting independently and rather selfishly, actually, to compete and use the natural resources that are available, whether it's water, air, forests, land production, the soil productivity, biodiversity, forests. So it's about how these are used and done actually to the expense of others. So you end up compromising and you end up in very degraded landscapes, very degraded ecosystems which are not resilient to climate, cannot maintain the productivity of the ecosystem services coming from them, but equally, creating conflicts between society and the business operators there. So let's have a look at the low road. The low road is about understanding your socio-ecological context. So understanding how nature works, what nature's producing, what nature's potential is, and how you maintain that capital so that the flows of natural capital and stocks that come through in ecosystem services and nature-based solutions are maintained. So it's really about protecting things that are important, understanding what needs to be maintained in those landscapes, and working with a common objective. And this is where the mitigation hierarchy comes in. So if we look at understanding that picture from a natural systems point of view, we know which parts are important, not only from a species perspective, but a productive habitat, resilient habitat, and the integrity of those habitats. And that's where we go to the low road. Now, lots of people think the high road should be the other way around, but this is my preference. So this is the socio-ecological system I'm talking about. Again, nature-centric. So what is nature? What is the nature that's there? How do we define that? What are we doing about impacting and depending on it? And how can we work with our neighbors to make sure that we're not compromising each other's use of it? But also, are we paying a fair price for it? Are we taking that into account through, internalizing some of these externalities? I mentioned nature-based solutions. I'm sure there's lots, and we know there's a whole hub going on down the road on nature-based solutions, but this is a really critical part around how we address the solutions, I think, in these landscapes. What nature-based solutions can we put in place to help us maintain the intactness of these systems? How can we look at better options through the use, but also the productivity and returning nature, getting that recovery as mentioned? So 2 final slides from me before I hand over to Helen. One is just how we start this. So the CALM framework takes us through this kind of systematic approach. We know that, if you're an agricultural farmer, if you're a smallholder farmer, if you're a miner or an oil and gas developer, or you're a renewable energy producer or a forester, it's highly likely that in that landscape, you'll be neighbors to each other. You never operate in isolation. You don't. It's just, it's just a fact of life. And yet we are consistently identifying our impacts at a very localized level. We want to only manage what we can see inside our fence boundaries. And that's not how nature works. And that's not how we are going to get to a nature positive setting. So if we set a nature positive, or at least a kind of, at the very least, a nature no net loss objective in a landscape, and work with our neighbors, we can start to see this. So we apply the mitigation hierarchy, as I mentioned, to work through this. And actually, if I'm avoiding something through my mining operation, and it's actually, protected forest that then gets harvested for wood, and perhaps gets put in, an agricultural landscape, then we're sort of at odds with each other. So how do we make sure that our common objectives are set? Clearly, we need policy interventions to help us do this, but every actor needs to be there. Lots of words. I'm not going to focus on this because this will be available as a stock for those who want to look at it, but essentially it's a summary of what I've just said. So I'm going to look at Helen now, if that's okay. Helen, I'm going to hand over to Helen. So you will introduce yourself.
Yeah,
and then
I will
I'm
introduce myself.
Good. All right, thanks
Hello,
very much,
everybody. Nice to see you. It's really great to see you. As Johnny just said in the over there in the other, the IUCN stand, it's so nice to be not on Zoom. So thanks for taking the risk and being part of this. And all those who couldn't be here, hello. Hope you're safe and feeling good and feeling like you're part of this. It's really terrific the effort that's gone into to doing the whole virtual in-person combo. So thanks. So my name's Helen Crowley. As Pippa said, I'm head of Sustainable Sourcing and Nature Initiatives at Kering, which is a global luxury group. It owns 14 luxury brands, Maison, we call them. So it's like everything from Saint Laurent and Gucci to Boucheron. So we have watches and jewelry and fabric and leather goods and so on. But prior to that, I spent 20 years as a conservation biologist. So I've come into this, into the supply chain world, into the corporate sustainability world with the framing of conservation and field-based conservation. So what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about first, before we actually get to the landscape, is how do you actually get to the landscape when you're working with a company that has these globally diffuse supply chains. Now, later in the panel, I think it's Anglo-Americans going to talk, and mining companies have their obvious footprint, right? Which is why for many years we've been working with that industry in conservation, because you can see the footprint. With companies like mine, whether it's the food or the fiber, let me focus on the fiber sector mostly, although it's intimately linked with the food sector because we get our wool from sheep that might also be sold for meat. We get our leather from cows, and that also might be part of a dairy system or a meat system. So let me just focus a little bit on that. So it's really hard to think about landscapes when you're at one end of the supply chain where you're making products and clothes. And it's really hard for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's the diffuse nature of the global supply chains. Now we've got a lot better at tracing and understanding where our stuff comes from, and it's an absolute imperative. You can't be a sustainable company unless you know where your stuff comes from. So that's one thing, is like just sort of figuring out what is the relationship that we have with nature. The second challenge is, well, why is that relevant? How do we focus? Like, you know, I've got my retail stores. I want to make them carbon neutral. I've got my waste, you know, and recycling. I need to focus on that. Why is it that nature, because it's a long way away in my supply chain, why should I focus on that? So the important thing there is to have some sort of framework of understanding the interface of business, and particularly in our business, with these long and complex supply chains around the world. So where in the world should we be focusing? Why should we be focusing out there in Australia with the wool producers, or South Africa with the sheep leather producers, or the goat herders in Mongolia for cashmere? And that's where what we had at Kering, and what's happening more and more with companies, the corporate natural capital account, really help. Because what it does is it creates a footprint. It's an imperfect but powerful tool. It just gives you a vision of where in the world your business is having an environmental. Let's start with just environmental. So, you know, water use, water pollution, land use change. So first of all, you get an environmental footprint, and it shows that 70% to 80% of our footprint as a company is all out there in the farming landscapes, right? It's all out there in the farm. So that challenge of like making this nature business interface relevant, the landscape approach relevant, comes once there's a sort of recognition that, oh, hey, this is where we really have to focus attention, that while doing LED lighting in the retail stores is super important and part of a climate strategy and part of an emissions reduction strategy, a lot of things are happening a long way away from our stores, and so we have to focus on that. And for the last 10 years, that's what I've been working with across the brands and with the team and with a lot of you in the conservation community, figuring out how do we then operate in these areas farms mostly that are a long way away from our business that we don't own. How do we leverage change? How do we support transitions to the right sort of change? And what does the right sort of change look like? So we've heard a lot of, so I just wanted to sort of frame it like that. So the word landscape, if you talk to anyone in my business, they're like, okay, well now they get it because we've been doing it for 10 years, but it's like they think of a farm, but they don't usually think of a landscape beyond the farm boundaries. So now we've got to create a context and a relevance for that nature business, that supply chain nature interface, and understand why that's important and what we. Then it says, okay, I get it. 70% of my footprint is out there where I grow my leather and my wool and my cashmere. What am I going to do about it? Now, there's been a lot of talk about regenerative agriculture, which is brilliant because at least it's sort of bringing that idea of restoration, regeneration of these agricultural landscapes. But we have to go more than that, and hence our sort of attempt here at moving to nature positive. It's not just about regenerating the soil, it's how do you create a coexistence with wildlife? How do you create connectivity across those landscapes? And so we've stepped through over the last decade, and many other companies, and notably the Fashion Pact, which is 71 fashion companies, are working through this very quickly now to understand, okay, I get that I have a footprint in my raw material sourcing. I get I need to do something about it. It isn't just about doing less bad, it's about doing more good. It's a restoration, regeneration agenda. It's not just about a sort of neutral agenda. What does that look like? How do I do that? Like, how do I go to an Australian sheep farmer and say, I want a restorative, regenerative wool from you? How can I help you do that? What does it look like? Well, luckily, there's a lot of great work like what you're doing. And there's some great work in Australia, fantastic work on dams, how you build dams on farms to enhance biodiversity in these landscapes. So, because what we're doing is we're not working in the 30% of protected areas, which is a whole another discussion on how to do that. We're working in that 70% around. So we've got to stop the pressure on the really high value ecosystems, but also we've got to restore in those landscapes, and it is hard. So I'm really happy to hear about the work that you're doing. I'm seeing some work all over the world where this idea, it's not just the farm boundaries, it's the landscape, and being able to articulate back to a company, this is what you need to push for in your supply chain, but not only just push for, this is what you need to support. You need to support the transition of these farmers and these small-scale producers, large-scale producers to move to this different way of doing things, being more connected, being more collaborative in the landscape, and so on. And it's a challenge, but we're at the beginning of that, and I'm seeing it accelerating more and more. So thank you all. That was just sort of by way of intro. We can talk a little bit more about this in this discussion. Thanks.
Helen, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. And it brings a whole new perspective, really, I think. And I certainly think there are a number of challenges that you've raised, but also an honesty around the narrative too. So I've got a few questions myself for later. We're going to move to video now with April. And so if we all, this is going into the online component. Is that correct? Who am I with? No, not April. Ah, yes, we've got Craig Triboulet, who's Head of Sustainability Operations at April, and he's prepared a video.
Forest, so we're about 81% of the way there.
Thanks very much.
Oh, it's a very good afternoon from Jakarta, and I'm sincerely sorry I can't join you in person today there at the conference, but I wish everyone the best of health. I'm really grateful to share the opportunity to discuss some of April's experience with multi-stakeholder collaborations for effective landscape management. April is a leading producer of fibre pulp and paper with forestry plantations and manufacturing operations in Sumatra, Indonesia. And as you can see in this map, just across the straits from Singapore. We manage about 450,000 hectares of plantations, and in 2015 made an ambitious commitment to have 1 hectare of plantations for every hectare of conservation. And as you can see, we're We've got 365,000 hectares of conservation and restoration forests, so we're about 81% of the way there. But by any measure, a significant commitment to forest protection and restoration. We've been involved in forest conservation and restoration since the early 2000s, and in fact we were one of the first companies to voluntarily apply high conservation value assessments, and we stay closely involved in the conversation around HCV. And this includes a very significant component of stakeholder engagement and recognition of multi-stakeholder approaches. And one of the key lessons from our work over that time is that in fact stakeholders are critical to any landscape management. They can make or break the success of a project. A quick background on the context of Indonesia, for those who aren't familiar with Indonesia beyond Bali, there's about 280 million people in Indonesia. It's got a very high population density of about 145 people per square kilometre, and this puts enormous pressure on land as a resource. And while it's progressed rapidly over the past decade into a dynamic, highly competitive and decentralised electoral democracy, it's worth noting that nearly half of Indonesia's population live in rural areas. Farming is their main occupation, and households in this informal agricultural sector are more than twice as likely to be vulnerable to shocks such as food price increases, environmental hazards, and related to this pandemic, ill health. It's important to recognise, I think, the context, expectations and interests of your stakeholders, because they need to be involved directly in any stakeholder engagement processes to ensure that both nature and society mutually benefit. And stakeholder collaborations does come with challenges. I've outlined several of the more headline challenges that we've experienced in our work. And this is not to say the glass is half empty, but to certainly acknowledge the context and reality of stakeholder engagement. And they include basic issues like identifying key stakeholders, understanding and identifying their key needs, achieving agreement with stakeholders with competing interests, and particularly in developing economies, acknowledging that often institutions may not exist or be under-resourced and may not be able to provide the sort of assistance and capability that they may provide in the first world. So I've got three case studies where I want to talk through that demonstrate effective approaches. One that's been in our operation for quite a few years, and a third one that is quite new and is quite exciting. The first one I want to talk to you about is our fire-free village program, commenced in 2014, and this really recognises the challenge on land use and the demand of the various stakeholders, competing interests of various stakeholders in the landscape. It reflects the increasing pressure on land, and in fact was developed as a community engagement strategy to improve fire awareness in local communities and to assist them to formulate sustainable alternatives to fire as a land management tool, and also to provide appropriate incentives to support desirable fire management outcomes. In many cases, fire is the most cost-effective agricultural tool available, and in some cases it is also the only available agricultural tool for land preparation. But often the long-term costs associated with the use of fire were not immediately obvious or poorly understood, and the fact that the impacts extended beyond local communities was often ignored. These included impacts on deforestation, biodiversity, economic losses, and tragically human health. Initially, in fact, most of the community partners we engaged with did not even consider that there was a problem in their use of fire or fire management. And so as a result, collaboration with a range of stakeholders was essential to clearly and simply define the problem and to provide the project with a common starting point with all stakeholders. And this then allowed us to develop solutions that were specific to each specific stakeholder. And from that, we developed formal agreements between parties to ensure consent and to clarify the agreed outcomes, the specific trade-offs, and acknowledge any outstanding issues that may not be dealt with specifically under this program. And the result of that work, as of last year, is that we now have nearly 700,000 hectares under voluntary agreements with villages, and we've reduced burning and all the impacts associated with unmanaged burning by more than 90%. So there's one example of a successful and effective multi-stakeholder collaboration. One of our masthead programs is the Restaurasi Ecosystem Real, RER. This is really a pioneering private sector-led collaboration to restore and conserve ecologically important high conservation areas on Indonesia's Kampar Peninsula, but also on the island of Pulau Padang, a province in Riau, an island in Riau. We collaborate with communities and technical experts like our friends here today at Flora and Fauna International to allow communities to continue to use forests in ecologically and sustainable ways through education and training, while at the same time working with local partners to improve livelihood opportunities to reduce potential and ongoing threats to the forest. This required us to develop key partnerships with experts, technical experts like FFI, local experts like Badara and Laskar Alam, and collectively these partners provide the essential expertise in landscape management and supported by the knowledge of the local communities that depend on the forest have resulted in extraordinary outcomes at a landscape level. There's been no new land encroachment or fires in these RER licence areas since 2015. We've developed an eco-camp and associated research facilities and include local community members in our staff and our working and all our work associated with the RER project. As of last year, we have had a total of 823 species identified in that area, and that's largely thanks to the incredible efforts of the FFI team in their field work in identifying these species, including 76 mammals, the iconic Sumatran tiger, of course, and our friend the flat-headed cat on this image here, a range of birds and dragonflies, amphibians, reptiles, and even a new species of fish. But it doesn't stop there. We continue our work, and one of the most exciting projects we're involved in currently is the development of what we call our conservation forest management framework. This is an inclusive framework to protect, restore and enhance identified conservation values and to address the company's conservation commitments, as well as expand our capability to local partners and help our community partners identify, manage and monitor conservation forests. Participatory planning and engagement and collaboration with surrounding communities to continue to utilise these forest areas in ecologically friendly ways while providing the training and at the same time the incentives to protect those areas has resulted in reduction of the threats to the remaining forest outside our concessions. This is a growing area. We continue to work with a range of technical partners, ProForests, the HCV Resource Network and others to guide us in the development of our conservation forest management framework. So just in summary, what sort of lessons have we learned from our experience in working at a landscape level on conservation and restoration projects? Well, one, and clearly, is that the key interests of community partners are generally quite practical, tangible and pragmatic, and you need to address those very pragmatic, tangible expectations in communities because these are their immediate concerns. You also need to acknowledge within the scope any trade-offs or limitations within projects and not raise people's expectations beyond what you're able to achieve within a project. It's critical to understand the capacity, skills and needs of all the stakeholders involved in landscape projects. Nobody can do everything and experts come in various shapes and sizes and it may all contribute something different to the discussion. Integrated participatory planning is essential and should be done as early as possible in the development. Good practices should be collected, reported and integrated into standard procedures to ensure that work can be repeated. And finally, I want to make the comment that large-scale landscape-level projects can only benefit from multi-stakeholder collaborations that include local communities, technical experts like FFI, universities, research organisations and other local, national and international networks to inform strategy and guide operational outcomes. And these collaborations are critical to the success of any landscape approach. Thanks and enjoy the rest of your conference.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Craig. That was very comprehensive and covered a lot of ground, but also amazing to see things happening on the ground. And I'm glad FFI got such a good recognition there. So, you know, an important partnership and a lot of technical, you know, sharing of expertise and capacity, really. Our next speaker, going to come in remotely, is going to be Julie Renaud from Nespresso, and Julie is Sustainability Strategy and Stakeholder Manager. So Julie, welcome, and thanks for joining us remotely. We can see you, which is brilliant, so I'm going to hand over to you in the clever way that systems allow. Can everyone hear her now?
Today, I must say, I wish I could have come and join you in beautiful Marseille, a city I love very much. And unfortunately, due to COVID, we are on travel ban yet and until the end of the year. Anyway, that's really a pleasure for me to be again in one of these IUCN Congress, because I was in Hawaii and already talking about the Cerrado platform that I will give you an introduction just now as well. But at the time, 5 years ago, obviously we were still in very early days. So probably what I'm going to try to explain to you today as part of multi-stakeholder initiative is the journey that participants have to go through before things become autonomous and fully sustainable to manage a landscape in a sustainable and yet productive way. So when it comes to Nespresso, obviously we are a coffee buyer, we are a coffee roaster, we are known for our capsule, we are known for George Clooney, but probably less known for buying coffee from the Cerrado region in Brazil. Yet Cerrado, one out of 8 coffee cups today have coffees coming from Cerrado. So it's really a big region for coffee production. And we've been sourcing coffee since 2005. So it's almost 20 years ago now when we think about it. And as part of our journey in coffee sourcing, we have been engaging with producers already for a long time. And by 2010, all the producers we were sourcing from, and we are still sourcing from, have been going into a first step, which is the certification of their practices versus the Rainforest Alliance standard. So it's been already more than 10 years that the producers have been into this rainforest certification. And as part of our collaboration with IUCN, so we have now a 10-year collaboration with IUCN, we decided to go for what we call an ecosystem services review. That was back in 2013, so 7 years ago, because we felt that it's nice to work on farm and to do the best on farm to manage the farm responsibly and with traceability. But we were feeling that probably the farmers were depending on services that were outside their farm, and that's why we needed to know better where the services were coming from and if they were endangered. So that's how it all started. There was an ecosystem services review done with the experts. And what it revealed, this ecosystem services review, is that indeed, if we were not putting in place a system that would enable an integrated approach when it comes to coffee supply and in more general terms, reliability, sustainability of agricultural products in this region, then the farmers would be in danger of not having any more the services they depend upon. And that was a big breakthrough, and that's how it all started. At the time was really a collaboration IUCN Nespresso, but through our network of agronomists and our network of partners in Cerrado, we raised awareness on this risk. And the very first, let's say, seed of this multi-stakeholder project was to design a vision, a common vision to protect the landscape. And this common vision was around water, because indeed one of the services the farmers depend upon the most is water. And that was making the link as well with protecting the biodiversity and the specific native vegetation that is in the Cerrado Minero landscape. It's a savanna. and it's rich in biodiversity, and this biodiversity, let's say, or this ecosystem deliver the services amongst other of water. So back by the time, let's say like 2016, there was a common vision, the fact that we needed to do something together, beyond even the coffee sector itself and just the few producers that we were engaging with. And that's where IUCN really helped us designing a proper governance on to design an autonomous multi-stakeholder platform that is now known as the Cerrado Water Consortium. And this fully autonomous, now Nespresso is just one contributor of this platform. But it's true that just as well to give you some of the success factor to have that autonomous body now working and looking at the landscape in an integrated way. One of the key things was really financing and dedicated resource to design that platform, to design the governance that was necessary to then put the people together around the table and decide on an action plan that would protect their landscape for their future and for the future also of the citizen in that region. And one of the things that has happened as part of this multi-stakeholder platform is, so we go step by step because we cannot, do the overall Cerrado Minero region in one go. So we decided to go for a pilot project in a watershed called Corrego Feio. So it's really as well where most of the coffee producers were located when it comes to producing coffee. And then we designed basically an action plan. And thanks to the design of this action plan and as well the engagement with other stakeholders, we managed to also attract external financing from the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund that enabled to basically put into life the plan that was designed by the different stakeholders. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what I can share with you, and I'm happy to answer any question. But what I want to possibly convey as a key message is that it's nice to work on farm responsibly, but it's not enough. And that's what we really understood with this work in Cerrado. There is a need for an integrated approach to make sure that the landscape becomes viable for a productive future as well of the farmers, but also for some stability of the population, because this could create some water conflict if the landscape was not properly managed between the citizen and the agricultural stakeholder. And really, through this consortium that was put in place, we are now feeling much safer that there is a forum for the citizen as well as the farming stakeholders to be discussing the future of their landscape. So that's what I can say for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julie. Thanks very much. Sorry, I'm speaking to myself in my ears. It's never a good thing. That was wonderful. Thank you. And hopefully you'll kind of stay there and get some questions and help, come back when we go into the panel session. We're now going to start opening up for some questions, but I'd like to invite Helen, who has a few more words to say, to come come back on.
Hi.
So,
Since I'm the live person here, I thought I'd take the prerogative of saying a few more words, because I wanted to just highlight a few, just a couple of more tangible actions that we've been doing as a sector, not just as Caring, because I think that you've heard some really tangible actions on the ground and in the landscape. So there are three main, when it comes to our agricultural raw materials. And in fact, forest-based raw materials, but let's just focus on the agriculture. So I'm talking about cashmere, cotton, leather, wool. There's also mohair and others, but let's sort of focus on those four for the moment. They're really important for us. the way that we've been working with the farmers, once we've realized that, as I told you before, that we've got to focus on that interface, so there are three main principles. One is no conversion of natural ecosystems, obviously high value or not, no more conversion of anything to production land. The second is this regenerative approach, which is a regenerative approach for the soils and the species above the soil as well, the plants and the wildlife, and a wildlife-friendly approach is about allowing this coexistence with wildlife and allowing for more connectivity across farming landscapes. And we do that in different areas around the world. But we realize that we're still sort of on this learning, how are we going to sort of roll this out and replicate this more extensively across our 350,000 hectares of raw material. That's about our footprint for raw material. So we launched a fund called the Caring Regenerative Fund for Nature, and we just announced the first 7 grantees. The goal is to restore and regenerate 1 million hectares of agricultural landscapes in those 4 supply chains around the world. But when we say restore, it means building this connectivity. It means wildlife-friendly approaches. It means working with recreating habitats on farms, whether they're farm dams or they're rocky outcrops. It means planting the right species for forest corridors that can help restore native bird populations, as well as climate mitigation and other things. So we've been working with these grantees are now going to sort of create a sort of global experiment, if you like, across several countries: Argentina, South Africa, France, Spain, Mongolia, where we're really going to test out these approaches with the people on the ground, with the farmers, but also the local experts. So how do we create a nature-positive approach for cashmere production, for wool production, for leather production? What does that look like, and how do we support that transition? So we're trying to really experiment more with what we can do. We still need to get our measurements. We're still working with experts so we get the right measurements so that we can say, yes, we are heading to nature positive. Yes, we are restoring the right species in the right place. But just to give you a bit more flavor, and behind at the back, we sort of have this little display, and we're going to launch it tonight at 7:30. And there won't be a lot of talking. It's really just to have a drink and a chat. But we wanted to sort of make it very tangible, say, look, here's some materials that we're working with, that we're trying to say and are moving towards nature positive. These materials from these farming landscapes that are supporting biodiversity, restoring, protecting soils, and so on. And also materials that are actually coming from expanding our biodiversity that we're using in a sustainable way. So materials from yak, materials from wanako, and other species that are free in the wild, but that can be used and in a sustainable way. Very early days for some of that, but we just wanted to sort of highlight in a more tangible and touch and feel way the type of things that we want to do at Caring, but in the fashion sector more broadly.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Helen. Right, so I'm just really grateful and we've got Craig, so thanks Craig for joining us. That's brilliant. I don't know what time of day it is or night where you are, but thanks for joining us. These are fantastic examples of display of our dependency on raw materials from nature, and that actually trying to secure and sustainably use our raw material supply chains is really what it's about. But there's also been a fantastic demonstration, I think, around the need for collaborations. So collaborations with local communities, building up capacity of local communities are very often the very people who will help to implement the interventions that are needed. But that's very much part of what used to be the old kind of business case, I guess, for biodiversity. It's not around raw material, it wasn't around raw material supply chains. It was about risk, reputational risk, being able to operate in landscapes because you weren't being picketed at the fence, that no one was shutting down your operations. So this is a major shift, I think, and a clear demonstration that actually we can operate very sustainably, or at least far more positively, in a landscape when we start to take into account, as all our presenters have, the kind of the nature, nature as natural capital, but also the need for nature to be healthy, resilient, intact, that we need the composition structure and function of nature to be maintained. So I think that's the kind of one of the kind of key messages. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions now, and I'm going to probably start with you, Craig, really around the interventions that you've had of building capacity in the local communities who are helping you to deliver these big landscape projects. And just perhaps reflecting on, you creating a sustainable raw material supply, does that manage to get to a producer or at least a user that is able to trace that sustainability all the way through to market or into, what I might be wearing or might be, on this piece of paper? Can you just reflect on that and how you maintain the integrity through, I don't know, assurance processes or a kind of chain of custody that helps us, the other end of the market?
Thanks, Pippa, and good afternoon. And to my panellists, Julie, Helen, great to hear your presentations this afternoon. And in fact, I think you picked up on a point that we hadn't quite covered there, and that's about the monitoring, reporting and verification elements of all this. How do you assure people, in fact, that what you are doing, what you have committed to do, and where your policy commitments have set you forward? So that's a really important question. And for us internally, it's not so difficult. I mean, we have very long-standing partnerships with suppliers, and we do a significant amount of due diligence in working with our suppliers, and we, of course, independently assure those, and those reports are publicly available on our websites. We show mapping, as I did in that initial presentation, of where our supply comes from, and we're certified under PEFC systems. And so I think while that can provide assurance, I think we need to go almost a step further, because we've got to remember that not all stakeholders have access to or maybe are dealing with sophisticated processes like certification and assurance. And so sometimes the processes, particularly with local stakeholders, is not about sophisticated mechanisms like that, but it's about engaging them in an ongoing conversation and communicating with them and respecting their capabilities and knowledge and assuring them that they're part of the ongoing dialogue. Because without that, it's very easy to sort of set the project going and then leave those people behind. And so it's critically important that you bring those people along with you. In regards of how do we trace back, particularly with that sheet of paper that you're holding, I assume that's paper one, of course, Pippa, and the viscose that you may be wearing that comes from the mills that we produce man-made cellulosic fibre from, it's more complicated because there's other parties in the supply chain. And so it's about engaging downstream as well. Thank you, Pippa.
Thanks very much, Craig, and those were the sort of answers I was looking for, so that's brilliant. I'm going to turn to you, Julie. Really, we know that coffee was one of the leaders. We know that most coffee on the markets is actually now sustainable. So how do you maintain that? And then a second question, whilst I've got you, is that you talked about competition in the landscapes, about other land uses, and can you perhaps talk a little bit around that? So what are the threats to your efforts in the landscape, in the Cerrado, that may undermine the gains or the contributions that you made? And is there a mine nearby, or is there a big railroad going through there or something where we can start to look for the competition? Thanks.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it bridged really well with what Craig was just saying in terms of the traceability. When it comes to Nespresso, we are really positioned in a very specific part of the sector because we buy coffee profiles. We buy specific sensory profiles from different regions, and that's why year on year, for the last 20 years, for the last 30 years since Nespresso exists, but 20 years is specific because we started to develop a sourcing program with full traceability down to farmers. And it's when I say that, it's also because farmers receive a specific premiums to be part of this program and to basically adopt practices that are along the lines of the Rainforest Alliance standards, to make it short, but basically to really have a sustainable production. Helen was talking about regenerative. This is also a journey we are in now, because the foundation is really to make sure we minimize the negative, and then now, as we will evolve towards 2030, we will also make sure we will maximize the practices that have this positive effect on the landscape. So traceability is really at the center, at the root of what we have been doing since 20 years at Nespresso. And that's basically how we maintain, because on the ground, we have relays through the partners, and also an important element, which is a network of agronomists visiting the farmers and really being on a kind of day-to-day relationship with the farmers, making sure that the yearly plans progress. What I found interesting as part of the Cerrado project is that we integrated this, let's say, Nespresso-specific coffee sourcing program into something that is bigger, that is driven by the Fédération, it's called, the Fédération of Coffee Producers in this region. And they develop what they call the Conscious Producer Program. So the AAA program, which is the Nespresso specific program for coffee sourcing, is integrated into something bigger in that Cerrado case, which is the Conscious Producer Program, where the federation promotes very specific practices and very specific actions to be integrating the farm action into the landscape actions. So that's really important. When it comes to risks, I'm not aware, I'm based in Switzerland, I'm relying on my colleague who are in Brazil. I'm not aware of any specific risk. It's just maybe one thing that is important in the process, and we are not yet there fully, is land users that are not coffee producers, for instance, ranchers or any other kind of agricultural production in the arena. And I think we need to continue this engagement process with the other type of agriculture or even type of industries in the landscape that also need to be integrated into this platform, because we cannot make without them. As I said, the coffee producers are committed, coffee producers, coffee traders, coffee brands, because now it's definitely beyond the Nespresso brand to be involved. It's Nestlé, Lavazza, many very known coffee brands in Europe. And yes, we need to make sure to avoid any kind of threats coming from other sectors, to integrate these people as well in the discussion. And to make sure because they are part of the watershed. So we don't want, like what is done on one side positively is destroyed on the other side, or that the service is depleted on another area of the landscape. So that's what I can.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much, Julie. And that sort of speaks to what I was saying earlier, that we are all part of complex landscapes, that water flows through our properties. Nature has no boundaries, really. Helen, I'm coming to you. So do you mind getting back up onto the stage here, please? So caring has a very complex suite of supply chains. We've heard from Nespresso in April, which is essentially one commodity, it's one source going in. Now you've got multiple, so you've got everything. You mentioned some of them. It's the animal fibers, it's wood fibers, it's skins, it's various products that are all coming to you. How do you prioritize that? And then, how do you know where to start? Because, there will be other companies that are here today who will be going, we don't know where to start. How do we prioritize how we address our landscape footprints?
Thanks. Great question. I mean, I sort of alluded to this at the beginning with we were lucky. It was visionary. It wasn't luck, I guess, that 10 years ago when I started at Caring and we launched this sustainability endeavour, this new sustainability endeavour, was that we had this natural capital account, the environment profit and loss, that came over. It was first developed at Puma, which was one of our brands at the time, and it came over. And what it does is it maps our footprint, our environmental footprint. Now, It implies biodiversity impacts, of course, because of water pollution, because of land use change, because of climate change. Doesn't necessarily get specific about what type of biodiversity impacts we have, but it does give you a picture across your supply chain, and it's by supply chain by supply chain. It's not a product thing. It's like, what does our cotton supply chain impacts look like? What does our cashmere, what is our leather, what is our, and it's a combination. After 10 years, there's a lot of real data from our supply chains, but there's also some modeling and so on, and life cycle analysis data, but basically it helps you prioritize. It says this, and so I'll give you an example, cashmere. We don't use a lot of cashmere. Relative to other fibers and materials, it's a very, very small percentage of our use, our basket of raw materials, and it's a very small percentage of our driving our revenue. However, when you do an EP&L, it came out really high in terms of impact. I mean, really high. And it because of the land degradation. Well, there's a couple of reasons. It modeled that because of the land degradation coming across, in Mongolia and Inner Mongolia, but sort of that Central Asia area from goats, but also linked to climate change and climate change impacts. That plus the fact that you only get a small amount of fiber from each goat, it takes a lot of goats to make a cashmere sweater, meant that it actually comes out really, really significant in terms of. So we went out to Mongolia to try and figure out, well, what can we do about this? Because this is it's a beautiful fiber. It's from traditional, it's culturally important. It's, a smallholder producers depend on it. So we've spent the last 6 years working with herding communities, working with Wildlife Conservation Society, actually collaborating with, there's a mining company that also has a mine in the area who need to be net positive. So they needed to also work across these rangelands. So we created, that's a landscape collaboration. We created a collaboration where we work on more sustainable grazing practices with these herders. So that was an example of, highlighting a priority through this natural, and then just having to go out and make it work. It's still in progress, but that's how we got that priority. And I think what's happening now with the Fashion Pact and the 71 companies who are all in the process of developing their biodiversity strategies, and who are all in the process of also getting a lot of great input from experts, whether it's UNEP, WCMC, whether it's NGOs, on this exact thing. What should I prioritize? When it comes to climate, we sort of get a good idea. When it comes to biodiversity, what should I be prioritizing? And we're starting to map that pretty quickly so that we can actually do collective action in certain parts of the world.
Fantastic. Thanks, Helen. So something that Julie, you mentioned was looking at an ecosystem services review to help identify what you were getting out of a landscape, and I think that's one of the sort of key things. So there's that, so it's understanding your natural environment as a context, and it's understanding your stakeholder environment as a context too, and then how, I guess, all of those bring the competition and conflict, or perhaps collaboration is what we're hoping for, to the whole picture. A great example of the southern Mongolian landscape, where actually we can seek in our landscapes other land users that can help us to resolve our problems. Because if we're all aiming for a nature positive or some sort of biodiversity enhancement objective, there are other actors who we can work with. So I personally believe that there is a enormous potential for example, the big extractive industries to work very closely with the agribusiness and smallholders and plantation managers to actually work on the best kind of pathways towards the avoided loss or the protection component that you need in order to get a landscape that is recovering. We've got to break down those barriers and start talking to each other in a more cohesive way, but importantly in a way that helps us, we're very bounded by the sort of environmental impact assessment process. Now, I don't think that applies very much to agricultural sector as it does with the extractive sector, but the EIA is essentially, your footprint and then what happens. If you look at what cumulative impacts might happen, or look at a strategic environmental assessment that takes you into the landscape and asks you to understand where your rivers are flowing to, where your watershed, where your airshed is. I don't think we think about the airshed in the same way, but how do we work on these collaborations? So I guess my next question is going to be focused a little bit on the kind of the partners on the ground, their expectations. You've all mentioned expectations. Because my expectation as an NGO will be different to yours as a company, but they are going to be very different too from what a farmer who's trying to get a living out of his land is going to be asking for. So how do you help to incentivize and match those expectations so that we can create the change that becomes part of that collaboration? I think I'll start with just Craig, if that's okay. Just go run through Craig, and then Julie afterwards, thanks, and then Helen.
Thanks, Pippa. That's a tough question, isn't it? And I guess it gets to the crux of the challenge of engaging with stakeholders, and that's about values. And I like your point about that EIA sort of concept. We of course refer to high conservation value assessments, or as they're combined with HCS and HCSA assessments now, to help define values. But I guess how do you price and pay for these services that you've alluded to? We're quite sensitive to this, and we were quite sensitive to this in 2015, for example, which was a particularly dry season in Indonesia. And you talked about air quality. We measure air quality. We're very sensitive to it, given that smoke from forest fires is a significant contributor to haze. Normal background levels of air quality here, PM10 levels, are about 20 to 30. Very, very healthy air here in Sumatra. During 2015, we were getting haze levels of 2,000. You physically could not see across the road. And so when you have as dramatic and catastrophic impacts like that, it's often a little bit easier to go to communities and talk about values, particularly around health. But what I found interesting when we started those discussions is that communities had actually just accepted that, and they called it the haze season. Actually, it just became another part of their day-to-day sort of profile or annual profile. So then we had to stand back and work with communities then to put some sort of value on the impact that was having on them as communities. And so that's where in my presentation I said we had to go back and help them even fundamentally understand the problem. We're very sensitive to paying money because we often think that maybe doesn't always directly relate to good results, but certainly incentives and recognition that there has to be a payment, not necessarily cash, but a payment for those services, because it's unfair to just expect local communities to bear the costs of conservation, restoration and changing their practices just because it's the view from other people. And so we try to value that, recognising that people are going to be economically rational. And what I mean by that is they're going to do a comparative analysis of the value that you're going to offer for that environmental service versus what else they could get, for example, palm oil. And so you have to be able to match those market conditions. The other benefits we can provide, of course, to communities in terms of value in those services is providing long-term certainty and long-term reliability in the relationship that we're offering communities, which they don't often get, particularly around land security in Indonesia. And so being a partner who's going to be here in the long term is also an important thing to account for in valuing those environmental services. Thanks, Pippa.
Thanks very much, Craig. And Julie, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, Craig said quite a lot. Maybe I can also just give the example through the platform. Incentivization is definitely a starting point. That's what is core of our sourcing program, to make sure people adopt the practices and they are paid for this, the change of practices and any kind of investment they need to do for the change of practices. But then beyond that, and when it comes to the landscape approach, probably, when suddenly we say, okay, this area needs to be protected because that's the source of the water, for instance, it means no more production of coffee on that land, or a specific attention, a specific kind of practices. So there is a need for payment for ecosystem services in the sense of compensation for a loss. That's a mechanics that needs to be looked at. And that's where, the consortium and the governance of the consortium with the technical body, the leadership body, etc., they can decide what makes sense for the local stakeholders on how to be compensated. It's true, Craig mentioned, it's not necessarily just about money. It's true, it can be something else as well. And that's beyond the compensation of loss. Indeed, the trigger to the action, and that was key as well for the Cerrado, is that Nespresso was committed since 2013 to put in place this body. So we invested to have a dedicated person to look at the design of this platform. And then when came the moment of this entity to be fully autonomous, the idea is that we needed commitment from other brands, from other stakeholders to finance that body, and think about what are the right mechanisms to be sustainable over the long term. And one of the mechanisms we are right now looking at is also how can we look at the carbon credits that the Cerrado soil is basically absorbing or is creating, to put it into a business case of for people who will be interested by carbon credits, to be basically promoting specific practices that then enrich the soil in carbon, and then we can, in a way, trade this carbon for a sustainability of the practices. So that's what is in the pipeline right now, because I think quite a lot of people are interested anyway into these carbon credits. And that would make sense because it's highly connected as well with the practices that the farmers are doing in the farm and outside the farm.
That's fantastic, thanks. So nature-based solutions coming in with the co-benefits and how we harness that so that the benefits that are accruing financially or otherwise are helping to get back to those who are actually doing projects. Helen, over to you for a few thoughts.
Thanks. So it's already been said, so let me just try and sort of reiterate it in a slightly different way. I mean, for any of this to work at a landscape or a site or through your supply chain, it requires quite dramatic supply chain transformation. It requires a collaborative, moving from a command and control sort of, this is what we want you to do in our supply chain, to a collaborative approach. These are the joint outcomes we would like. We would like to have a restorative, wildlife-friendly approach, and working with the NGO partners, the academic partners, with the farmers to say, well, what do you think? I mean, a lot of farmers don't want wildlife on their farm, especially wildlife that eats their animals. So you've got to start, we've got to sort of figure out what works for them. How do we support that? So it has to be a very different, and it is. This is what we've all been saying, and I think companies are realizing, is this collaboration on outcomes too. I think that's where we get to that's where we can start. Look, it's not about a specific certification. It's, hey, we want this outcome. Does that work for you? How do we get that? So I think we can come into alignment. But this issue of reward and value and incentivization is huge. And I think we're heading into a really interesting era of how do we finance these transitions. Sure, there's a role for the company, corporate finance. There's certainly in pricing. These stewards of the land, these communities, these producers are the ones doing the work, are the ones taking the risk, are the ones changing practices. So we have to reward and support that. And there are different ways, as my panelists co-panelists have said, and I think we can be smart around that. We've had years and years of working with communities in conservation projects and so on, and so we can be smart about figuring out what works for those, working with them to say, what is it? Is a pricing? For sure, there's a pricing element, but there are these other elements. And so I think how we finance these landscape approaches is a very exciting new era where there's public and private financing. There's all sorts of, nature-based solution investment fund. There's a lot going on, and I think we've got a moment in time where we can get really smart about making sure that we can reward the right practices and help the transition, because it takes a while to transition. None of us really like change. You know, it's pretty hard if you're a farmer to change. You know, you've got to support that. So.
Thanks very much. And I think, you know, can I just get a sort of hands up on if there are any questions in the audience that you'd like to ask? Okay, great. Because just before I come to you, this whole idea of finding innovative financing models is really, really important. And I had a question from a company that said, you know, I've got 1 million cubic meters per site offset. Have you got projects? So it's a supply and demand too. So one thing is working with the actors in the local communities, but sometimes it's also, you know, what do the conservation community offer back? You know, can we provide the type of projects that companies can contribute to help them enhance and become nature positive too? Because, you know, it doesn't always have to be species by species. It needs to be beyond that. So I'm going to ask, is it Peter, do you want to just speak into this? And hopefully the panel can answer. I'll hold out if that's okay.
No, I'm just going to try and get breath.
Deep breath.
Yeah, firstly, I think that we cannot go forward without looking at landscapes and managing landscapes. But we do have a challenge, and a lot of green solutions are not biodiversity solutions. They're green to us, but not to the wildlife. And in a planet where we're at 7.5 billion, nearly 8 billion people, and it's sort of going to top off at about 10 to 11 billion. That's a lot of resources to keep those people healthy and live, and you're going to lose biodiversity. So it'll change the structure and function of your landscape, whether you like it or not. But what I really wanted to talk about, and coming from Africa, where we've got people coming in and have been for many years telling us how to do stuff. And we've been working and talking about community collaboration for many years. And we've been very poor at it. For one reason, we've always come to the community with our idea. And it hasn't been with what the community want. And and that is what I find missing here. So it's great you guys are working in Indonesia or wherever it is, but still you're going to the people and wanting them to change their way of doing things. And when you're working at landscape level, there are different levels of cooperation and collaboration. At your level and at the coffee level and at the production level, it's at with the factories and so on. But with communities, work on the specific things that need to be addressed on the ground, that the community, the farmers and the tourist industry, and so there are a whole bunch of people involved with that influence your value chain, but have their own issues. Your value chain is just part of the whole process. It's just part of the process. So the whole thing is, no, I'm just saying that it's the people on the ground need to be empowered to make the decisions. And we keep on coming to them with our ideas and imposing it on them.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was trying to say, that, you know, you've got to talk about the outcomes and see if it works for them as well. The outcomes that we want, do they want the outcomes? I mean, things like soil restoration, I think most people who depend on the land would like that. But you're right. I'm not saying that we can come with all the answers or what to do. We say these are the sort of outcomes that we would like, we need. What do you think? You know, the cashmere herders, you know, it would be great to have less goats. But we're not going to say you need to reduce your goats. Yeah, we need to say, like, how can we work with you so that you get more value per goat, that your goats are healthier, because that's what they want. They want healthy goats, and then we got more value for goats, each goat. And so, you know, how do we make that work for them, for the outcome that we want, which is ultimately, excuse me, a more restored pasture land. So I totally agree. I'm sorry that hasn't come through, because I think we are trying to do that approach, learn from the mistakes of the past.
I think so, and a socio-ecological approach would definitely require that, whether it's starting with FPIC or full consultation. Julie, you have a hand up. Would you like to comment?
Yes, I can't see Peter. I think the name of the person who just asked the question, but
Peter Mills. Yes.
I can only share what you just said, because this is as well one of the critical elements, this community consultation. That was at the core of the Cerrado, that is at the core of many other projects or initiatives. I don't like the word projects, because this is the way we do business, but of other initiatives we have in other countries. I don't know where you come from, Africa. I understand you come from Africa, but we are working with communities in Ethiopia, in Kenya, to transition to agroforestry systems for coffee farming. And I can tell you, they say their words. And, we all know that coffee farmers, wherever they are, wherever the level of education, there is a level of education which is knowledge by experience, knowledge from the past generations, that we need as well to leverage very much in the design of the project. So there is no one project design just as a top-down. It's really about consultation, and I think that's also something we learned from the collaboration with IUCN, because IUCN is really, really more than keen, but really basing every single design of project we do with them based on consultation of the stakeholders. So it has to be the representation of indeed all the stakeholders, including, of course, and for sure, the communities, because at the end of the day, they are the one to implement, and they are the one to finally decide for what is best for them. So it's really about iteration and consultation and conversation, if I may say. But it takes time. And, I was talking about starting 7 years ago, the Cerrado. Honestly, at one point, I also say to IUCN, if there is only Nespresso, no way. I'm not going to continue to finance anything. And that was really a critical moment where we really thought about what governance, what makes sense, who should be really involved, who should be committed, particularly to financing, to make sure that the things were triggered and that it could be sustainable as well over the years. Because there is no way, we are not an NGO in the sense, and sorry for that, because we want things to be working on the long term. We don't want just to come for one project and then go away. We are sourcing, as I say, year on year from the same regions, and I think that's also what my other colleagues here in this panel are sharing. It's about also long-standing relationship. There is no other way to do this transformation that is needed.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Absolutely, and I think the transaction cost, the time taken to actually establish projects is something that we must never forget. So the time we need to take to work and understand community needs, what the different stakeholder components are to establish these projects. It's the same with RED Plus projects. You can't kind of just say, right, I'm going to buy that piece of land, it's going to start producing carbon, or I'm going to contribute $1 million and suddenly I'm net positive. It doesn't work like that, because these all take time, and conservation is a sort of socio-political process, really, isn't it? And that all takes time. So I think Craig's also got his hand up, and I'm conscious that we're nearly coming to the end of our session. So Craig, think of a couple of maybe, and also to wind up, maybe your sort of final words.
Thank you. Yeah, and look, thanks, Peter, for raising that, because I suggest we probably didn't dig into that deeply enough, and we probably didn't recognise the economic and power inequalities that often exist in these discussions. Can I just provide an example around fire? There was about 20 years worth of interventions in Indonesia around fire, recognising that fire was an issue. And yet 2015 was the worst fire season in Indonesia's history. So by any measure, those interventions had failed. And I think Peter has really nailed why, and it's because the problem formulation and all the answers were developed outside those communities and then delivered as a package to communities who didn't even understand there was a problem. And so we did a significant amount of work and specifically a root cause analysis of what was driving these problems, these challenges with communities. And that was the issue, was that communities didn't even think there was a problem. They were quite happy using fire, unmanaged fire, to prepare their land. It was cheap and it was effective. It worked. And so in a very respectful, very patient, we're now in our 7th year of the program process, it was about sitting down with communities, drinking a lot of cups of tea, but engaging in a conversation, actually, and not just providing answers, but just engaging in a conversation. Why are your children getting sick? Why is there alarming rates of stunting associated with children in Indonesia and impacts on brain development? And a lot of it was because of incredible high levels of haze during the fire season. And so we started to introduce those to the conversation. And it's not about a light switch moment. It's about a slow development and a respectful conversation with communities. And to Peter's point, some communities chose not to change, and that's okay. You know what, we still engage in a conversation with those people, but they're not part of this program. That doesn't make them bad. It just means that they've got different priorities, but we continue to have those conversations with those people. Just in a final point, I guess, to tidy up, and I note to time, thanks, Pippa, is that I think I said it in my earlier discussion, is that multi-stakeholder collaborations are absolutely critical, and the landscape approaches will...
Oh, boy,
technical experts like you guys or others, but they're absolutely critical. Thanks, Pippa.
Thank you so much. And I think it looks like we're having problems with the internet. But I think we got everything you said there, Craig. So I think, you know, fantastic sort of summary there too. One of the things we haven't spoken much about in this is the policy frameworks that have to underpin all of this. So it's all very nice to have lots of ideas and practices, but the burden doesn't necessarily sit on the business or the NGO. There has to be an enabling framework. So how we work to make sure all of that happens at the same time. So I think of your haze and the kind of fire issue, you know, there must have been some sort of legal framework that started to kind of match that, put that in place. So if you could just respond to that, and then I'll ask Julie just the role of policy in how you've approached your approach to landscapes, and then we'll finish with Helen.
Yeah, look, hopefully the internet holds up. Yeah, we're actually really proud of the fact that our fire prevention programs, for example, have helped inform policy, and we've helped the government of Indonesia in terms of their fire prevention initiatives as well. And so we're really proud of the fact that we're able to be a leading partner in that discussion. And that speaks to one of the reasons why companies should be involved in landscape approaches, because a regulatory framework will move on without you regardless. And so if you're part of the conversation, at least you can be part of the solutions as well. And so we're really proud of the fact that we've been part of the conversation with the Indonesian government and in helping them deliver on their ambitious commitments around particularly deforestation and fire management. Of course, as I said in my presentation, to internal audiences, your stakeholders, we haven't really covered that. Helen spoke to it a little bit. They're critical as well. And so having the right policy frameworks and a sustainable forest management policy guidance, but also in setting targets. We've set targets over 10 years under April 2030, ambitious targets, and they become the goalposts that guide your company's journey internally, but also the communications in how you frame your journey externally as well. And so they're really important, having the policy guidance, but also setting goalposts and ambitious commitments externally. I think they're really powerful ways of guiding the narrative. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Delivering on promises. Hey, Julie.
Maybe as well, just to build on, and really at a local level of policymaker and public authorities with whom we engage as part of the Cerrado, we discovered in our journey that there was actually a water fund managed by the public sector in the Patrocinio area where we started the action plan, but there was no way to disburse that money because there was no project to manage this water fund. And actually, just by engaging with them as part of the consortium, we told them, guys, we are your solution, in the sense that with the action plan of the Cerrado consortium, the money for water protection can be disbursed in really what makes sense. And actually, beyond policy and framework, it's also making sure that the public part of the sector is involved into as well the financing, and usually we identify things that we were not even knowing, because indeed the private sector is working with the private sector and the public sector is having his own framework, his own decision. But then by engaging with them, we unlocked unexpected financing, and now working all together and making sure that this is also a way to promote new policies, to promote new adoption of practices by the agricultural landowners.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. That's really helpful. And Helen?
Thanks. Just quickly, I better go out the front.
You're fine.
Go to the front. They were great answers on policy, so I won't add to that on policy. But I do think one thing there's probably lots of things we didn't talk about enough to the point that was just raised. But one thing that Craig just mentioned there is this framework issue. So I work across 20 plus supply chains across 30 plus countries around the world. And that's just the raw material, not all the processing and manufacturing as well. So that we've talked about prioritization. So if you do these wonderful landscape level collaborations and projects in different parts of the world, that's a lot going on. And what we need also is not only the financing part of it, but also a framework for measuring and reporting on, and saying, okay, so this is what, and this is where we need the conservation community and the academic community in this to help us. What are we actually, these are the outcomes we want. What are we going to be measuring across all those different landscapes that we can sort of roll it up and say, this is where we're going the right direction, we're not going the right direction toward nature positive. So I think we still have work to do, good work ahead and exciting work to create the right framing. You've got the science-based targets for nature. You've now got the task force for nature-related risk disclosure, which is creating a framework for how companies report and are transparent publicly. But also we need to dig in some details on what we're going to measure and track over time across these landscapes as well. Thanks.
That's brilliant. Well, thanks very much, everybody. And a particular thanks to Craig and Julie for joining us remotely. It's wonderful to have had you. Thanks for staying up late, Craig. Julie, and I hope your travel allows us to meet in person soon, or end of the year maybe. And Helen, remarkable. Thank you so much.
No, thanks.
Yeah. And thank you to you all for being here and for your interesting contributions. And we will see you at the science-based targets, setting those numbers, how to measure, which will be more of. And Helen?
And one more thing, just tonight at 7:30 here, we're going to sort of just have a very informal, some drinks and chat and talk about nature-positive materials and production and agriculture with our nature-positive materials there. Lovely if you can come by for a drink and a chat.
Fantastic.
Thanks.
And thanks, everyone. All right.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Pippa.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, hang on, I'm going to get my mask. There's lots of problems.
All right. Good. Thanks. You're welcome. That all needs to be wiped down, I don't know.